Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to In Conservation with another episode here. Tonight I'm joined by a gentleman which many of you may not know. I may be speaking ahead here of myself, but Graham Appleton is here, and one of his major things in life, as you can see behind him, is to talk about waders. So before I introduce you formally in terms of telling people who you are, a potted history, let me just firstly welcome you, Graham, to tonight's In Conservation with.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on the show, as they say.
Good. And by the way, I must remember the show is sponsored by Leica Sports Optics. So thank you very much for that. Now, Graham, for those who don't know, he is the author of a popular blog, which is called Wader Tales. So look it up, and it's read by wader and shorebird enthusiasts around the world. And basically he talks about newly published research papers and the works of authors to promote the understanding and conservation of this increasingly threatened group of birds. And we're going to talk about how we got into that very quickly. Graham and I have a bit of a history in that we used to work together, believe it or not. We were once work colleagues. We were once waving hands down corridors and all that sort of stuff. We both worked for the British Trust for Ornithology 1,000 years ago. I was very small at that point. And I remember going to work wearing pinstripe suits, and I used to have cropped blonde hair at one point, but that's another story. You've had 3 separate careers, haven't you, Graham?
Yes, so this is my third as a writer. The first, I was a maths teacher and latterly attained the rank of deputy headmaster. And then at 40, I did a career switch and went into fundraising, and from fundraising through to being the director of communications of BTO.
Well, that's fantastic. And that's where we, I think we kind of crossed paths then for the first time. Now, in terms of your interest in natural history, where did that spawn from?
So I suppose there have been about 3 or 4 key moments. To start with, my grandparents were very keen on birds. Birds at home, I never went anywhere to go bird watching. And then I went to school at King Edward's School in Birmingham, which had got a Natural History Society. And it had got a Natural History Society because Bill Oddie had set it up some years previously when he was at the school. And it was run by the boys. And there I learnt a lot about birds from Tim Milson, who taught me about birdsong, and Steve Hunter, who taught me about bird ringing. And then Steve took me to the Wash, and I met Clive Minton and waders, and that has been the focus of my life, apart from when I've been earning money for the last 50 years.
You also are the treasurer of the British Ornithologists Union, which is a nice accolade. But what was interesting about looking at your particular biog is the fact that you are a regular contributor to the Shooting Times. Now, that was no surprise to me, because I think when I knew you were a bit of a quiet renegade. You didn't sort of fit the mold of the classic ornithologist back in the day at the British Trust for Ornithology, when it was a little bit more dustier than what it is now.
Yeah. I've never been a shooter. I've never shot. I went beating once, many years ago. But I accidentally ended up writing for Shooting Times, because when I was at BTO and we were looking to publicize the Migration Atlas, I suggested that I could write a couple of articles about the BTO. And when I left BTO, I said, "Do you want some more articles?" And they said yes. The reason for writing for Shooting Times is it's a really great audience. They're people who are interested in the natural world, and they like hearing about birds. They like hearing about what the work the BTO does, the RSPB does, from somebody who's independent. And it's just seemed like a good role to take. I think it's a very small country that we live in. And we have to be able to work with everybody. So it's a bit of a mission to basically spread the birding world to the shooting fraternity.
I mean, it does sound like a bit of a juxtaposition, actually, the two the two worlds meeting. But I think I agree in terms of the fact that it is sometimes a good thing. In fact, not even sometimes. I think it's always a good thing to be able to sit around the same table and discuss things. I mean, one example I've had in the past was speaking to someone who worked for a rail company, and they were in charge of electrification of lines. And basically, I said to her, because she came on one of my tours, I asked her, I said, do you ever speak with people like, the NGOs? Do you talk to them before you actually start your work? And she said, actually, we're never approached. So we're only approached once we've started work. So I think it's, in a way, it's good to be at the table before anything kicks off, really, so to speak.
Yeah, and with shooting times, it was easy because if ever they had said anything which was supporting illegal hunting of birds of prey or whatever, then I would have walked straight away. But they see that, the shooting times in particular, see that the work of the illegal activities by some gamekeepers and some landowners is really dangerous to the shooting fraternity. So they really push against it. So it was okay. And it was a really interested audience.
Waders, or shorebirds, to give them their sort of, I suppose, international name. I'm not sure which one's which actually, but they are a group of birds that are very special to a lot of people. I know that, for example, I am very keen personally on watching waders, even though sometimes I'm struggling when I'm, trying to decipher a semi-palmated plover or semi-palmated sandpiper, even from a dunlin or whatever. They are tricky. But what is it that do you think people find so appealing, birders in particular, find so appealing about waders?
I think it's just how impressive they are as migrants, and the fact you can go anywhere in the world and see largely the same waders. They span the globe in many ways, as I shall talk about.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've seen turnstones and sandlings practically on every shore I've been to, in all four corners of the earth. I remember being on Hawaii once, and I'm not sort of being flash, actually. I was in Hawaii in my other guise when I was a PA to a director making music videos and TV commercials. And we were on Hawaii actually making the Guinness commercial with the surfers and the horses, and and I remember my first morning waking up and I was looking out to sea from the hotel. There was these massive waves, but no wind. I was like really perplexed by that. But I went out and I saw wandering tattler, which I was really excited by. But then I saw sandlings and turnstones. And I thought to myself, oh, well, that's a bit of a reminder from home. But basically, home for them is the whole world, as you say.
Yep. So those two, and grey plover as well, or black-bellied plover in the Americas. Those three species in particular are just about everywhere.
Okay. Well, you know what? Let's hear what you got to say in terms of your presentation, and perhaps we can have a conversation afterwards.
Yep. So
sorry, Graham. Whilst Graham's getting his screen up, for those Zoomers watching now, the best way to see it is if you go to the speaker view on your actual vision, on your screen, because then you'll see the whole screen as opposed to just a load of boxes of people's faces. Thank you, Graham.
Fine. And with a bit of luck, I managed to get a slurp of tea without being on the show. So, you're ready for me to go, David?
I'm totally ready for you.
Fine. Okay, I'm going to talk about waders. I'm going to talk about waders because they're a cause for concern, but I'm going to try not to be too disheartened because there's some excellent stuff going on to support waders throughout the world. Now, I would like, just a minute, thank you. So we're losing space for waders. There's a really great article in the latest issue of Wader Study, and because it's a perspective article, it's available for anybody to read, which basically worries about how we're losing space for waders, as it says in the title, and particularly for breeding waders, but it's actually for all waders everywhere. And I'll just give you a few examples. That's semi-palmated sandpiper. You mentioned semi-palmated sandpipers, David, and that doesn't look like a semi-palmated sandpiper, but if you go far enough west, their bills get so small that they look like that. Semi-palmated sandpipers are getting squeezed. They're getting squeezed between the trees which are advancing north and the receding ice to the north of them, so that they're losing space to breed. Species like snipe are being lost as habitats become more suitable for farming, and species like snipe are taken out of the picture. That Hudsonian Godwit, that's a species that's losing space as well, but in a very different way. In one of the most recent Way Details blogs, I talk about Hudsonian Godwits and the fact that teenage birds spend time in Argentina, in the Pampa grasslands of Argentina, which are being ripped up to turn into agricultural land, because there are more and more of us, and we're looking for more land to grow food. There's also expansion of forestry for all sorts of different reasons. And if you look at that patchwork in Ireland, you can see how curlews have been taken out of the picture. Curlews like to have a nice open vista, and that is not a good habitat for curlew. And we're wanting to build everywhere. So developments for mining, for industry, for building, are just squeezing waders, whether they're on the coastline or whether they're in grassland or whether they're in their breeding areas. One of the particular species that we're about to lose, there's only 660 birds remaining, is the latest estimate, is the spoonbill sandpiper. I think they're just lovely. It's such a nice bird with a little ice cream scoop for a beak. And that's a bird that breeds in the far northeast of Russia. And in those very, very fragile lands where ice meets land, and they nest on these of the shingle ridges which form when the ice goes away. And here, the more and more trees are approaching that area as the life gets warmer. And spoonbill sandpipers are being squeezed out of the mix. And I'll talk about those shortly. There's one of the recent Way Details is about the spoonbill sandpiper. In this country, let's come home. We're losing birds as well. Again, the squeeze. This time it's the vertical squeeze. I don't think anybody's surprised to hear that dotterel breed at the top of the mountains, and they breed in alpine habitats. So they're looking for the sort of the mosses, not the grasses. And as we get warmer, so these sort of habitats disappear. And it's not only the warming, it's also the amount of nitrogen that is deposited from the air because of the way that we live our lives these days. Is causing more and more grass growth further up, and the dotterels getting squeezed out. If we go further down into Scottish Valley, there's a lovely study, a really depressing study by Mike Bell, who's one of the BTO's regional reps in Scotland, who studied the same valley for 25 years. And during the whole of that period, he was watching the number of birds decline. That's a 95% decline in oystercatcher. You can read the other figures for yourself. And that's just the way that we use farmland. More and more, a lowland farmer's field looks like a cricket pitch in terms of its monoculture of grass, rather than like the traditional grass land that a red shank would like to find somewhere to hide. And on the right is the curlew. And the curlew is probably the species that's getting the most publicity at the moment. We know that in Ireland, 96% of the curlews have disappeared in just about 30 years. That's 3,300 pairs down to, if I remember right, yep, I've just checked, 138 pairs in 35 years. And that's really scaring the people of Ireland who care about their curlews. But if you look at the changes in Wales and Scotland and England, we're seeing that thanks to the Breeding Birds Survey, we're seeing that numbers are going down rapidly here too. The trouble with curlews is that they require a lot of space. And if you look at all the curlews around the world, when I was born, there were 7 curlew species in the world, and there are now 5. We talk about parrots going extinct and all sorts of species going, but I think people don't really think about waders as going extinct, but in fact, we've lost 2 curlews. Eskimo curlew, certainly from the Americas, and slender-billed curlew, functionally extinct. It's so long since one was seen, they're probably completely gone. And you'll see if you look down that list a little bit further, you come to our Eurasian curlew. So the trouble with curlew is they need a lot of space. If you want to know more about the decline of the curlew, there's a wonderful book by Mary Colwell called Curlew Moon. And she walked 500 miles across Ireland and England, and as Ireland, Wales, England, and through Scotland to look at what was happening to the curlew and wrote about it. It's a lovely book. And one of the great things that comes out of it is that people really care. And I think if you think about extinction, it's so depressing. Just think about the people who care, and it's far more uplifting. So people are doing something about it. It's not just a sort of gnashing of teeth and just wailing into the in the corner. This is a nice picture I took, or a set of pictures I took when I went out with the RSPB's Blacktail Godwit team on the Neem Washes. And they're the team who are trying to work out what it is that makes a good habitat for nesting Blacktail Godwits. The idea being to try to replicate those conditions so that the numbers can go up. And remember, only about 60 pairs of Blacktail Godwit are left in England. So making sure you know what the right things are for them is really, really important. And here's another excellent piece of work by RSPB. This is Burney Marshes in Norfolk. And what they're doing there is making sure that you've got the right habitat you need for breeding waders. And this picture is taken in the wintertime. There's not that much water under in the summertime, but you can see all those ditches that are running through the land. And Mark Smart and the team of people from a variety of agencies who put this together, what they're trying to do is to create as much wet edge for waders to feed in as possible. So whereas traditionally ditches are used to drain land, here the ditches are used to bring water onto land to create the habitat that breeding waders need. And that's a really huge effort. It's written up as a Managing Water for Waders Wader Tales blog, and it's a really impressive thing. And not only is it producing land for waders, it's also producing land that farmers can use. There's going to be more water for summer grazing, and it's also relieving flood pressure. One of the good things that waders have got going for them is that they live a long time. And you can see some of those records there. Now, what that means is that if you can get things right, then waders have got several years to push out 4 chicks a year and can really boost numbers. And we saw that in the Neem Washes between 1999 and 2006. If you look at that red arrow on the graph, you can see that the number of pairs of, so the white bars at the bottom there are the Neem Washes pairs. You can see that the number of pairs almost tripled in the course of those 7 years. So that's a really good point. Get the habitat right and waders can recover quickly. And that's what RSPB is trying to do in many places, as are WWT and other organizations. One of the problems is predators, because when you create a really great place for nesting waders, of course you pull in the predators as well, because there's nothing else in the open fields around there. So you're going to pull in the predators, whether they be foxes or stoats or marsh harriers. They're coming into the area to look for food. There's a lot of work going into putting into fencing these areas to create the right to create predator-free areas. But there's also ways of controlling foxes by getting them to move into other areas by providing food in other areas. You can read more about that on Wader Tales. And if all else fails, there's head starting. Now, head starting is just revolutionized the way we think about recovering wader populations. Head starting is taking eggs into captivity, the first clutch, because the waders will lay a second clutch later. Take a clutch of 4 eggs, produce those long-legged little waders in an incubator, feed them up, and let them go. And the idea is that this can boost the population because you're taking predators out of the picture. And in fact, this started in 2017. The left-hand map shows where those baby Blacktail Godwits went to when they were released from the Lean washes. And the right-hand map shows them on their way back in spring. Those birds will have actually been down to Senegal or one of the other African countries on the west coast of Africa for the winter, and this is them coming back. So two messages from that slide. The first is, this was a tremendous success. Suddenly we had a way of boosting Blacktail Godwit populations in an area where they were had almost disappeared. And secondly, it's an international situation. It's an international project. Birds go beyond our borders, and we have to be able to provide conservation initiatives beyond our borders too. Because they're tremendous travelers. I'm not going to go through this here. There is a Wader Tales blog called Which Wader, When and Why, which gives a quick run through of where 40+ species of waders go to or come from when they're coming to UK. So it might seem like that last picture as if we know about wader migration. I'm going to just give 3 examples of news stories which have really fascinated me over the last 2 or 3 years. The first is oyster catchers. And this is just using old-fashioned colouring sightings and people seeing colour-ringed oyster catchers. On this occasion, these are oyster catchers that are ringed in Iceland and that have come to spend the winter in, or most of them come to spend the winter in Ireland, Britain, occasionally France and Spain as well. So 70% of the oyster catchers leave and cross the Atlantic, 30% tough it out in Iceland. And there's several blogs about this study system, but this is the coolest new result. And that is that if you are a chick belonging to an oyster catcher parent in Iceland, if your dad is a migrant, you become a migrant. If your dad is a resident, you're almost certain to become a resident too. But if you look at the left-hand graphs, mum is irrelevant. So basically, they are doing the same as their fathers, but they don't travel with their fathers. And you can read about why that might happen, or even ask about that one to happen later, perhaps, but you can certainly read about it on the latest Wader Tales blog. So it's the dad effect. If your dad is a migrant, you become a migrant as well. And it's all down to behavior. So that's been found out because coloring adults and their chicks have all been found in their wintering areas. And that has required a lot of work by bird watchers. Thank you very much for every sighting. Another way of finding new stuff out is using geolocators. That's those little devices that you put onto rings. That's the little, you can see a little black spot on the left-hand lime ring. And that is the geolocator. So you put it on one year, the bird goes away, lets you know where it's been when you catch it the next year. So you take it off and download the data. So on the left is a book that I produced with Jim Flegg back in 2004 called Time to Fly. And Time to Fly gives maps of where wind will go. On the right-hand side is what the map should look like, because we've discovered that come the autumn, all wimbrel flies straight south from well, almost all wimbrel fly straight south from Iceland to West Africa, and a few of them manage to do the same thing in the spring. So our vision of what migration looked like was changed thanks to those little things. That's a second new thing that I've learned through doing these studies. And this one was amazing. So take a picture of the world. That's the globe. So you're looking at half of the world there. And in the bottom left-hand corner, you've got Somalia. And in the top right corner, you've got Chukotka. Now, Chukotka is the furthest right bit of Russia. If you go any further east, you're in Alaska. And Somalia, as you know, is Northeast Africa. And ring plovers were discovered using geolocators to travel all the way from Chukotka to Somalia in the autumn and all the way back in the winter. And that is a huge distance. When you think about our ring plovers, some of which hardly move 100 meters in their lives. This is an amazing migration. The other thing that amazed me about this was learning about Chukotka, because when that ring plover gets to Chukotka, it will be in the same area as temming stints from India. Ring plovers, as I say, could come from Egypt. A buff-breasted sandpiper, which has come up through the Americas from Brazil and then across the straits to Russia. A spoonbill sandpiper that's gone to Myanmar or Burma, depending on what you want to call it today, and not to Australia. So this one place sums up just how global waders are, that waders from all over the world were gathering in this one place. And my last news story is that geolocators have shown that if I'm a sandling and I want to get from Namibia to Greenland, I go up to what is sometimes called the armpit of Africa, just because that's the shape, not for any other reason, cross from Nigeria to the Mediterranean. And then some of them will spend a part of the spring in the Netherlands, some of them in Britain, and then across to Greenland. And the idea that a shorebird, a bird that really wants to be on the shore, would also cross the Sahara in the same way as a cuckoo or a swallow was really amazing to me. One of the other things about this is that there's a paper that's been produced by Jeroen Renekens, who did this work, which shows that there are many places you can spend the winter if you're a Greenland sandling. You could spend it in Scotland, England, France, Portugal, Mauritania, Ghana, Namibia, or all the places in between. And the interesting thing is that if you travel to Namibia, your chances of survival are a lot higher than if you only go to Ghana or Mauritania. But if you stay in Scotland, if you stay in England, you do just as well as you do in Namibia. So it's those places around the equator that are not good. So there's then the question, if you as a sandling spend the winter in England and your brother or sister or cousin or neighbor spend the winter in Namibia, why does that happen? How do you end up being in one of those places? And that's where happenstance comes in. It's really important to realize that things happen to a young bird in its first winter, in its first autumn, and it ends up somewhere. Wherever it ends up, it will always go back to the next year. That bird that spends Christmas in Mauritania, where it has half the survival rate and is much less likely to get back to Greenland in its first summer, has no idea that it's a rubbish destination. It's the only thing it knows, and it goes back to it next year. So this, it's an important thing about waders. They do what they've always done. Not every species is declining. If you look at the Wetland Bird Survey results for UK Avocet, you can see that the numbers have just rocketed over the last few years. A lot of this is down to nature reserves, but it's also due to warmer winters and much easier conditions for them. And another species that's been doing pretty well in some areas is the Blacktail Godwit. A Blacktail Godwit, lots of them spend, I knew that was going to happen. Blacktail Godwit, a lot of them breed in the Netherlands, where the numbers have gone down by 75% over the last 30 years. But some of them breed up on the edge of this distribution, on the border between Finland and Russia. And there, Blacktail Godwits are doing well. Blacktail Godwits are also doing well in Iceland. If you look at the map of Iceland, you'll see that if we look back to 1900, they were only breeding in the southwest corner of the country. But if you look now, they're breeding all the way around Iceland. This map is now out of date, and they're breeding in far more areas. So how, if Blacktail Godwits are doing so badly in England and the Netherlands, are they doing well in Iceland and Russia? And here you come up with the answer, and that is that climate change isn't always a bad thing for all birds in all places. And Blacktail Godwits are really enjoying the fact that springs are warmer in Iceland than they used to be. It means that there are more places where they can breed, And because it's warmer, they can breed earlier and have more successful chicks. So you can see what's happened to the Wetland Bird Survey graph for Blacktail Godwit. It's really taken off. One of the things that also has happened is because things are warmer and because chicks are being produced earlier, they seem to be turning onto a new and earlier schedule than their adults and older birds. And in that graph, you can see that the arrival date when they get back to Iceland is getting earlier as time marches on. And then what's happening is we've got new generations of Godwits on Blacktail Godwits are on a different schedule to earlier generations. And they're not only on a different schedule, they're also going to different places. Because when the Blacktail Godwits depart south in the autumn, young Blacktail Godwits are moving into new areas that their parents wouldn't use in the past. So you have new generations doing different. Adults still do exactly what they've done. So a Blacktail Godwit that turns up in Iceland on the 28th of April one year will turn up within 3 or 4 days of it the next year. Once it's on that schedule, it sticks to the schedule. And the pioneers, both in terms of new locations and new timings, are the juveniles. So how can we make a difference? How can we make a difference to what happens to waders? Well, I think you can see that it's an international issue. These are red knot and sandling, turnstone and dunlin feeding on the eggs of horseshoe crabs in Delaware Bay. And for the knot, these eggs are fueling a journey from Tierra del Fuego up to the Arctic. These are long distances, and these are big international operations to try to conserve waders. So I did a talk as a Twitter talk for BOU, which I turned into a blog called International Shorebird Rescue. And I think one of the key things to see is that there are 4 stages to how to rescue wader populations. Firstly, you've got to notice something has happened. That's down to bird watchers, counting things. Then you've got to understand why something's gone wrong. Then you've got to work out how to put it right. And once you put it right, you need bird watchers again to check whether numbers are rising. And it's really great in the wader world that there isn't really a gap between the people who do the field work and the people who do the political stuff to get things to happen. There are 5 people in this picture, and they're all really good communicators. And they would all, especially David Stroud, who's wearing a tie and a suit there, all would prefer to be wearing in the mud with the waders. But they've all got different jobs. So Clive Minton is talking about turnstone in the field. David Stroud is trying to persuade countries to get together to save wetlands. Jenny Gill is talking to the Essex Birdwatching Society, who funded some of the Blacktail Godwit work. Nicola Crockford, who works for RSPB, is again at another international conference trying to get things to happen. And Turnus Priasma is doing a TV broadcast. So these are all people who are advocates for waders in their different ways. So scientists produce papers, the NGOs and individual governments work together to produce proposals, and then they have to turn into international laws. So one of the reasons that this is so urgent is that we've already lost half of the great knot. And this is a crisis in the Yellow Sea caused by lack of feeding opportunities. But China is now increasing the protection for mudflats and really appreciating what it's got in those areas. So is North Korea, so is South Korea. And this isn't an accident. This is bird watchers, scientists, conservation organizations and governments working together to change minds in one of the biggest countries of the world. There's a recent Wader Tales blog about spoonbill sandpipers, which travel from Russia. Can I try pronouncing that? Minipugno, whatever. That little yellow star at the top right is a breeding site. And you can see where tracked birds wearing satellite tags these days, have gone in the autumn and through to the winter. And if you've only got 660 birds, you need to know where to protect them. And the only way to work that out was to follow the birds from A to B. And then the good thing is that when you get to these areas, particularly in Myanmar recently, good news for spoonbill sandpipers, instead of hunters hunting waders for food, they're now acting as bird guides, or they're being given subsidized boats so they can actually fish for their protein instead of killing waders. So the idea is that now we know more places where the spoonbill sandpipers go, we'll be able to identify hotspots which need to have conservation. There's still some problems. If we get time, David, perhaps we could talk about the Blacktail Godwits that come back to the Neem washes, which might come from Senegal through to Portugal, through to the washes, and are threatened by a big new airport development for Lisbon, right in the heart of the important area for Blacktail Godwits. So that was a bit of a rush through, I'm sorry, but there's plenty more on wader tails. But I just say how important it is to anybody who is a wader counter, anybody who who reports colouring birds, and to the scientists who are producing so much excellent stuff for me to turn into wader tails blogs. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Graham, for your efforts to put this across, all this information across to us, not just tonight, but generally, because it's such an important story to tell. Obviously, there's going to be a few questions, I'm sure. I just want to ask a couple of things just relating to your talk. One thing that's stuck out kind of in a big way for me is the situation in Mauritania and Ghana. What's wrong with Mauritania and Ghana when it comes to sandlings?
It's not a very productive, it doesn't appear to be a very productive area in terms of producing enough food for these birds. So it seems to be pretty general that if you go to these areas, okay, you're avoiding the snow and the ice that we get here, but it's not a great place for, there aren't huge amounts of food, and I think that's just the way it is. So I think it's more the fact that things are better here than they are, that it's worse there.
And is it because the fact there's not enough food or whatever, is that due to human intervention, or is that just the fact that the quality is not good there?
It's not. I can't give the proper answer. Let me do some research and come back to you. But basically, it seems to be just one of those things where you've got warm seas and warm land. You don't get the amount of invertebrate life.
Yeah, and the other thing I was interested in was the head starting, which, you know, in the case of waders sounds, so excuse the dog barking around the corner here. In the case of waders, I mean, it sounds great in terms of that, but I know that when people talk about head starting with hen harriers, for example, they're all up in arms. What's the difference?
It's a different species, and it's a very tricky question. For waders, it's easy because they're not being shot. The argument for people who say that you shouldn't be, as they say, brood meddling for hen harriers is the fact that why rear them if they're just going to be shot? Let's get the rest of the things sorted out first. The great thing about waders is in most parts of the world, waders are not shot. So therefore, if you produce more youngsters, they're going to turn into more breeding pairs, as is happening from Project Godwit. I don't think that everybody is convinced that even if you raise more youngsters, you're going to have more pairs if you've still got a large amount of illegal persecution.
Okay, waders as a family, you know, I mean, when I think of waders, I do sort of think more on the doom than I do on the good side in terms of their plight and their populations. And in particular, when you talked about curlews, and it seems like the curlew family is a bit cursed because of, you know, the possible extinction of the slenderbill curlew and the probable extinction of the Eskimo curlew, even though I'm going to be looking for it one day. I'm going to actually sort of dedicate 6 months of my life to go to America, or to go to the Americas to look for it. But that's another story as well. Do you think that, I mean, okay, we are like the roots of a lot of the problems in terms of, you know, pollution and land use and all that sort of stuff. But do you think that some families like the curlews are in an evolutionary kind of dead end anyway?
I think they shouldn't be, because you know, they can be so successful in the right circumstances. One of the things that you find out is that waders only need to produce a successful brood every few years. It doesn't have to be every year. What they need is space. And I think it's interesting that the group of birds, the curlews and the godwits that are under most threat are the ones that need the most space. And we just don't give nature enough space. And I think that's one of the big problems. The other thing, of course, is with climates changing, if you always go back to the same place you've been to, then if it's an unsuccessful breeding year, you're going to have another unsuccessful breeding year if circumstances are changed. The thing we see with blacktail godwits with this general generation change is the blacktail godwits in Iceland are doing well. There are lots of youngsters. There are lots of youngsters, so they can become pioneers and they can move into new areas. If you are a species that's not producing enough youngsters, then you do not have the pioneers to go out and find the new places. So therefore, you're not coping with change as quickly as a bird that's producing a lot of youngsters.
Okay. Claire Evans she's asked an interesting question. Claire, do you want to come live on stage, if that's possible?
Oh, okay, if you insist. Yes, Graham, when you mentioned about Head Start and rearing the waders, taking the eggs, do they imprint like many other birds do? Or because I think we've probably all seen photos of cranes being reared, and people go around dressed up like cranes and feed them like cranes. Do you do the same thing with those waders? Do they imprint in the same way?
That's a really great question. And the species where you get imprinting tend to be geese and cranes and swans. And the reason you get imprinting is because the kids fly south with the parents. With waders, what happens is typically mummy wader leaves the scene about halfway through the chick rearing, or possibly when the chick's just fledged. The father stays to fledging, or perhaps a little later, but he then departs before the chicks are ready to go. So the chicks won't leave Iceland. I keep saying Iceland because that's where we work. But those chicks won't leave Iceland until about 6 weeks after their father's gone. So they're not flying. There is no imprinting. So basically, there was a lot of people were worried when they started these blacktail godwits. So one of the things we wanted to know was, do the blacktail godwits that have been hand reared, do they migrate to different places? Do they behave differently to the ones that are raised with the parents? And the great answer is no, they do exactly the same. Basically, the parents become irrelevant at the stage where the youngsters are leaving.
That actually relates to my other question, is the impact it has on their ability to migrate and where they migrate to. So that's good to know. So it's a real positive for doing.
It's absolutely, it's a real game changer. So head starting's been used on the spoonbill sandpipers, and that seems to work quite well. And that was a last-ditch effort because they were about to go extinct, and unless we topped up the number of spoonbill sandpipers, it was going to be curtains. And it's been very successful. And now head starting has been used with the blacktail godwits, doing really well, and curlews seem to be doing okay as well. So it seems to be that with waders, if you've got the right habitat and you've got some eggs, you've got, yeah, it's fine. There's no replacement for finding the right habitat, but if you can get the habitat right, you can repopulate. Excuse me.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Let's actually continue about habitats and land use. Obviously, you know, that is important, and it's great to see the work of people like the RSPB and the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, you know, creating habitat and maintaining habitats for waders. It's interesting also. I mean, I'm here in Spain. For those who don't know, I'm in Extremadura, which is a great spot for birding. And I've noticed in my kind of unscientific way that some of the areas are very important for migrating waders. I mean, they have Extremadura is the third biggest, or I think second biggest producer of rice in the whole of Spain. And they have large areas of rice fields. And these are owned, they're kind of small holdings, but each field is pretty big. And everyone sort of harvests at the same time. So between, I think, say October, November, until almost the spring, there's this wetland that's occurred. And some of these areas are vast. And, I go there and there's, seemingly important numbers of waders coming through. I mean, there's a place not far from me now where last January we counted 3,500 Blacktail Godwits, and this January in the same area I found one field which is not even an acre, and it had 404 ruff in this field. And down the road there was another area where I found 55 spotted redshanks. I've never seen so many in my life. And then obviously the next day or a few days later they're all gone. So these places are important, but unfortunately the people that actually own these lands don't realize, and it's like a happy accident because they just happen to actually harvest at a particular time. They flood the fields or whatever they do, and it creates this really amazing habitat. And what I've noticed in the short time I've been watching these places is the fact that some of these people are now reverting the land to make them into olive groves, which are, in terms of biodiversity, absolutely disastrous. Which kind of brings me on to the Tagus estuary, which you mentioned earlier. Tagus estuary is in Portugal and Lisbon. And I've had the pleasure of being there a few times, and it's phenomenal. I think it's one of the best places to see waders in terms of passage anywhere in Europe. Thousands upon thousands of, not only flamingos, but, redshank and all sorts of different species. Can you just quickly kind of break down what's happening to this amazing area, which I think in the main is not protected?
Right. Well, that's A, a good tee up, and B, a very long question, and a very good question, because it raises a lot of issues about rice. So rice fields are really important to waders throughout the globe, whether you're talking about Western America or not surprisingly, China. In Africa, a lot of the Blacktail Godwits are feeding in rice fields. And just the changing of the timing of harvesting of rice can have a huge effect on wading numbers. Because waders basically have gone out of ordinary wetlands which have been drained, and they see rice fields as being a very good replacement. So rice fields and waders is just a joy. So if we compare Extremadura and your rice fields and the ones on the Tagus. So the Tagus estuary is surrounded by rice fields. So you can see up to 80,000 Blacktail Godwits in one large rice field. They are just vast flocks. So the rice fields themselves are sort of semi-protected, but they surround an estuary which is fully protected. And the estuary is important from everything from flamingos to ibises to a huge number of birds. And it is linking the birds that from the Tagus will be going to Siberia and Greenland and Canada and Britain and the Netherlands. And it's a really big junction. And the idea, there has been permission given to turn what is a military base with some flights into a major passenger airport at sea level, right next to the estuary, and in fact between two arms of the protected area. It's probably illegal under EU law. It's going to be a real stushy, and it's just a mad place to build an airport for both safety reasons and also because the birds are so important. And it attracts so many bird watchers like yourself and like myself to visit the area. So that's a potted history, but there's a couple of Way to Tell's blogs. One is birds or planes about the Tagus estuary, and there's more detail in there.
Okay. All right. Well, I think one other question I want to ask you quickly, actually, is obviously you're a man whose love for waders, is obviously very clear. How many, have you seen many of the world's waders? Are you kind of one of these people that's fairly kind of obsessed in terms of trying to see them all as well?
No, I don't travel much. It's just not something that appeals. I've never twitched. I don't go. I get a huge amount of pleasure out of common birds and learning stuff. I don't feel I have to go. So I spent 3 summers in James Bay. So I really like white-rumped sandpipers. But otherwise, I've not been, and I go to Iceland to work with Jenny quite a lot. But otherwise, I'm not somebody who needs to see a spoonbill sandpiper to appreciate how wonderful it is.
Well, yeah, I wish I could say the same, but I once, many moons ago, was going out. I had a girlfriend, basically, believe it or not, and she had a sister who lived in Bangkok. So every Christmas we go to Bangkok, and I convinced her one year to head in fact, she took me somewhere, some resorts, and we were in the resort. And I remember waking up the next morning and she had tonsillitis. And I said, don't worry, love, you stay in bed, I'm gonna go birding. And I basically got a taxi all the way to this place called Paktali, which is an hour and a half drive, where these spoonbill sandpipers were. Now we're talking about 5 or 6 spoonbill sandpipers in 50,000, 60,000 waders of different species. And I went there thinking I'd find it. And I remember scanning the whole place. I found loads of other stuff like great knots and long-toed stints. I had loads of great birds. And plus I found an Avocet, which is apparently rare there. But anyway, I then went back to base defeated. The next morning she woke up sick again. So again, I got a taxi and went off, couldn't find anything. And then I thought to myself, I can't be doing this every day. It's costing an arm and a leg. So I decided to contact a British birder in Bangkok and enlist him to help. So he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll come to the site and I'll take you both back to Bangkok. And I thought that's a good idea. So I explained this to my then girlfriend and said, listen, why don't we get up in the morning and get a taxi to this place and we'll meet this guy and he's going to take us back, but it's going to take us maybe like 20 minutes. We'll find the bird because he's got a telescope and I didn't, and then we'll come back. So I remember going out to this place with my girlfriend in tow, and we met the guy, and sure enough, in about 25 minutes, we did actually see spoonbill sandpiper. But then we saw a ton of other things, and I found a black-headed gull, and he thought I was amazing. 12 hours later, we're in traffic heading back to Bangkok, and I was in the worst doghouse known to man. So that's my spoonbill story, spoonbill sandpiper story even.
Yes, I'm not surprised the relationship ended.
Let me ask you another question. What, out of interest, is your favorite bird?
So I've been wondering, sat here in rural Norfolk, well away from the sea, what it is that I'm missing most. I'm sure I'm supposed to say Blacktail Godwit, but they stand on one leg and do nothing. I love sandling. I think sandling are the best of waders. So that's the species I'm missing most, and that's what I'm looking forward to seeing when we're allowed to travel again.
Okay. And obviously we're stuck in this awful pandemic. If you could be anywhere in the world, I know you don't travel much, but if someone gave you, a luxury holiday somewhere, or whatever, where would you be right now?
Right now, I'd be at Welney, and I would like there to be less water, and I'd be looking at Blacktail Godwits because that's what we do at this time of year, and it feels wrong not to be doing it. As it is, I'd probably go to the Braden Water and do the same. Look for Blacktail Godwits, look for the colorings. I know that Steve Lister would probably be at Frampton, and all sorts of people would be in all sorts of different places. But yeah, I'd be looking for Blacktail Godwits because that's what we do at this time of year.
Okay, you'll be a cheap date. Absolutely.
Yeah, yes, yes, always.
Okay, Zoomers, just to let you know what's coming up. On Monday, we have a lady called Ruth Weaver, a young lady who, during the pandemic, discovered the fact that she could sell art, bird art, and she's made a little business out of it. And she'll be here on Monday. She's an amazing artist, by the way, and many of you may not have heard of her, but she's a fantastic artist. She'll be doing a live demonstration and talking about her work. So that's on Monday, Ruth Weaver, 7 o'clock GMT. Next Thursday, the 18th of February, we have a lady called Kirsty Franklin. She's a scientist. She's doing a PhD, and she's counting, well, she's working with shearwaters and petrels in Mauritius, and she's talking about virtual bird counting, which is an interesting concept, I'm telling you. On Monday, the 1st of March, we have another lady. Her name is Alice Tribe. She works for BirdLife Malta, and she'll be talking about the hunting and how they cope with it in, or deal with it, should I say, in Malta. So her that evening is going to be called Saving Birds in Malta. So that's Monday, the 1st of March. And on Thursday, the 4th of March, we have a repeat performance, different subject, a guy called Silas Olafsson, who hails from, in fact, originally Denmark, but he lives on the Faroe Islands, and he'll be talking about birding on the Faroe Islands. And it's an interesting subject because it's one of the toughest places I've ever been to go birding. It's absolutely, you know, it will make or break you. That's all I can say. So anyway, that's what's coming up, Zoomers. What's left for me to say is, Graham, thank you for sparing your evening to come and talk to us about your work. Don't forget to read the Wader Tales. It's out there, it's on the chat if you want to go to the link. But thank you very much, Graham, for
Pleasure. My pleasure.
And Zoomers, it's always a pleasure to have you all here. I'm so happy that you made it tonight, because I know there's lots of other distractions, not least the serial going on at the moment with the impeachment. So thank you very much for coming, and look after yourselves in these weird times, and don't forget to keep looking up.